Helbig tonight. We're talking about equine biosecurity. And to be honest, I Googled equine biosecurity when we booked Holly because I didn't know exactly what biosecurity gets into. And Holly's going to tell us all about that. If you're with me, that's great. If you're like, a silly thing to Google. That's great too, because we're going to get into what is it, and then all the nitty gritty too. So wherever you're at in your knowledge of equine biosecurity, this is for you. But first and foremost, Dr. Holly Helbig, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us tonight.
Thank you, Jessa. It's so nice to meet you.
And before we dive into what is equine biosecurity, tell us a little bit about yourself. And I know you own your own veterinarian practice, but you did not take the conventional route to get there. So tell us a little bit about yourself as a vet and as a rider and how you got to where you are today.
Yeah, no problem. Yes, I have a very unique way of getting into vet med, into the position that I am today. Believe it or not, out of college, I was a wedding planner for the Ritz Carlton up in Boston. I absolutely hated it and got into actually pharmaceutical sales where I fell in love with medicine. I had been riding hunter jumpers since I was a young girl, but was that kid that always had to work super hard. Work extra jobs just to get to go to a horse show or muck stalls. I was one of those barn rats. And I fell in love with medicine, and some people talked me into going into vet school. So it took me 2 years of prereqs of night class while working a full-time job. And I applied to Ohio State. I'm from Ohio, and they let me in. I can't believe it. They let me in. And I spent 4 years there. During vet school, I rode professionally, and that's kind of what I did to make a little bit of money and help pay the bills along the way. Um, and when I graduated from vet school, I was so immersed in the horse show world, and teaching and training, just trying to make a little bit of extra money, that I decided to combine them, which everyone always says, oh, that's impossible to do. There's not enough hours in the day. And I like to tell young women and gentlemen out there, if that's what your heart desires, you absolutely can do it. Just be prepared to spend a lot of hours in the day. So for about 12 years, I worked as the official horse show veterinarian for the World Equestrian Center in Wilmington, Ohio. I also worked as the official vet for Kentucky horse shows. I did a little bit of work in Michigan, some FEI events. And then I also owned and operated a hunter jumper training facility with about 25 horses. And I kid you not, I'd be at the horse show riding professionally. I'd hear an emergency call, jump off, be in my riding clothes, my show clothes, and be palpating a horse 2 minutes later. So I kind of did it all a little bit. And I loved absolutely every single moment of it. And then about 2 years ago, I was approached by a company called Zoetis. It's the leading animal health company in the world. And essentially for them, it's kind of like consulting, right? So talking to other veterinarians about our products, talking about adverse reactions, helping with research and development of new products that are out on the market. And a lot of my work is doing this, reaching out to horse owners and veterinarians about awareness. And biosecurity is something I'm passionate about. We had a little bit of an outbreak at one of the horse shows. And so I kind of got pigeonholed into this, but it's something I lived through. So I love to share the story and talk about preventative care.
Yeah. That is a wild ride to get to where you are today, and it's just incredibly admirable that you continued kind of following your interests and following your heart, and even when it came to, like, being able to show and be a veterinarian and have your own practice and kind of do what you knew that was right for you and that you could do and were capable of, it's incredibly admirable, and I'm sure that when you were in vet school, you were sitting side by side people who had totally different, more traditional paths, and you were still there doing it, and it's led you to where you are today, which is just inspiring. I find it inspiring.
Thank
I'm
you.
sure that there are some people listening whose wheels are turning because it's not too late to change your mind, and it's really cool to see how it's worked out for you.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't the oldest. I was 29 when I went to school. There was a gentleman in there that was 50. There were a few people that had started families. So I love to share that message. And I actually feel really fortunate that I went when I was a little bit older. I had a bit of history working in corporate America, and just again working in any type of work environment, right, is a whole new learning
Totally.
experience. So I was lucky to kind of have put that time in so that in vet school I could really focus on veterinary medicine. So
Yeah, I love it. That makes a lot of sense. How cool. Well, let's get into it. Tell us what equine biosecurity is.
okay,
Do
well
the big
bios
unveiling.
Right. And really, biosecurity can go down so many paths. I'm so eager to hear all the questions that you have, because biosecurity is everywhere. It starts at the farm at home, and it carries through to horse shows. And the topic is all about preventing infectious disease and spread of disease among horses. I don't think we realize quite as much when we go to the horse show how we are commingling all of these different horses from so many different environments. And it's not only the risk at the horse show, but it's taking the horses back home. Or even if you're not involved with shows, if you go out trail riding, are the other horses vaccinated? Are your horses properly vaccinated? And it's not only just about vaccines as far as preventative care. There are so many acts that we can do that are simple and smart to help keep our horses safe and to keep the horses at home safe as well.
That's really interesting. And I'm sure as a horse show vet, that was one of the things in the back of your mind, having so many horses in one place, that there's this possibility. And you were talking to me before we got on about how COVID kind of made the possibility more real for people.
Yeah, I think it brought it to life, right? As a horse show vet, you get the call that a horse has a fever or seems off, is off food, and not acting right, and you just always have that pit in the bottom of your stomach, thinking, "Oh my gosh, is this herpes? Is this strangle? Something that would shut the horse show down and really affect all these horses and people's lives and people's livelihoods, right? Trainers, riders, owners." And so I think people weren't quite aware of it until COVID rolled around and people realized the impact that COVID had across the world. And in some sense, we need to think about that when we think about biosecurity with horses and how we can prevent horses have, there's a lot of disease states out there, right? And
Mhm.
how can we prevent those and make it so that the horse world is not on shutdown for, a year to 2 years?
Are the main diseases that you have in your mind when you're thinking about diseases that could spread amongst horses, especially in North America? You mentioned herpes, strangles, I think influenza is a big one. Are those kind of the big 3 that you're looking out for, or is the list much longer than that?
Yeah, the list even goes beyond that. So, salmonella, coronavirus in horses shows up as a GI disease that can be highly contagious. Um, did we cover strangles? That's the big one, the big deadly one. There's a lot out there. Herpes is the one that people talk about the most because it can turn into a neurological form that can be quite have a high mortality if it gets into that viremic state. Um, but there's many diseases out there that we're concerned about. But yes, I think you've hit the big respiratory ones that are most likely to be seen when we're commingling horses.
And how common are these diseases in North America? Like, are at any given time, are there always cases happening around the continent, or is it like a big deal if a horse is found to have herpes anywhere or strangles anywhere?
Yeah, so that's a pretty big topic. For the viewers out there, there's a really awesome website. It's EDCC, so the Equine Disease Communication Center. And you can go in, log in, put your email in, and they will send you notifications of outbreaks of different diseases. And that's across the country, that doesn't go international. But if you were to go on that website, you will see there are active cases of strangles, herpes, influenza. We've recently had some EIA cases, a bundle of cases, um, and they are out there. I would say a lot of horse owners will go through life and maybe never see these diseases, or even know that maybe their horse was affected by it because they're vaccinated and the signs are subclinical that they just didn't notice. But they are absolutely going on, some more geographical than others, right? Because insects and different things are spreading diseases, right? Um, but absolutely, it is going on. You know, herpes, there's been a lot of outbreaks in Europe that people talk about. And the other thing is that some of those diseases are reportable in some states, but not in others. So, in the state of Ohio, where I'm at, EHV1 or equine herpes virus, the neurological form is reportable. And I believe strangles is reportable, but that's not every state. So, this could be going on in your backyard and you might not even know it.
When it's not reportable in a state, what does that mean? That just nobody's collecting the data?
Yeah, so a reportable disease has to be turned into the state agricultural department, in which every state has a state veterinarian that's assigned, and they typically will come out and assess the property and the situation and help make biosecurity recommendations or environmental recommendations. They will often put a quarantine down on a barn, so no horses coming and going until X, Y, and Z. You know, all the horses are clear. You have negative tests, whatever that situation is. But they will help create a protocol that is in the best interest of the equine community.
And what would the reasoning be for a state having these infectious diseases not be reportable? Just lack of funding to support the necessary activities that would have to go on?
Yeah, I actually don't know the answer to that. It might also be geographic. So, maybe some states don't see certain infectious diseases as often as others. Quite honestly, I don't know the answer to that, but I do know a state veterinarian I could call and ask at some point.
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Mhm.
Um, let's talk about some of these diseases, like the most common ones that are happening and that people are concerned about. So, EHB, herpes, tell us what the symptoms are and what the kind of not worst case scenario, but what we're worried about because of how it can transpire.
Yeah, so equine herpes virus as well as equine influenza can be a little bit difficult to differentiate. Both of these the horses will usually present with nasal discharge. They'll be febrile. So, horses' fever or temperature should be normally between 99 and 101.5. So, a temperature of above 101.5 would be considered febrile in a horse. Um, some of them can just be very subclinical, so just kind of off feed, feeling a little bit punky, or just some nasal discharge. So they usually, they start out that way. Equine herpes can have a biphasic um, trend to it, meaning it can start off like a respiratory disease, become febrile, they can look a little bit better, and then they become febrile again. Um, the biggest thing about both of these is that they're very contagious through nasal discharge. So we were talking about this before we got on, but a horse's sneeze can actually go 50 yards. So that's half of a football field. So imagine you're at a horse show and you might feel protected because there's a couple stalls between you and the next group of horses that came from another barn. If that horse is infected and sneezes, it can affect up to 50 yards distance in which those nasal droplets can carry. And that's pretty significant, especially for people that are doing shows or traveling in their indoor facilities, right? Um, so yeah, I mean, we have to be very, very careful with those. And quite honestly, the best thing that we can do is be vaccinating for equine herpes and equine influenza every 6 months.
And do you recommend that everyone in the let's talk about the country. Everyone in the
Okay.
country is vaccinating for those things every 6 months, or is it somewhat geographical?
Yeah, so anyone who is going to any type of horse shows or trail riding or 4-H or anything where they're going to commingle from another barn every 6 months is recommended. I will say there are some barns where no horses come and go,
Yeah.
in which some of those horses I'll vaccinate once a year because they're not commingling with anyone else. But even if you are stabled, your horse is stabled in a barn and you're not going anywhere, but your neighbor is going to and from horse shows, then the recommendation is still every 6 months for vaccination.
Got it. And just to tie a bow on EHV, how does that transpire? Like, what does it evolve into? Is it a fatal condition?
It can be. It can be, and it's hard to really know who is going to experience neurologic symptoms, or abortion is really the other major side effect that we see with the equine herpes virus. Um, some of them will go into a viremic state, and that is kind of that second phase where these horses become infected, and they typically will get secondary neurological signs. We do know that there is no vaccine for the neurological form of EHV. There are some studies out there showing that vaccinating for EHV1 and 4 will help prevent or decrease the clinical signs if that horse were to become viremic and neurologic. There's a little bit of conflicting information out there, but I do believe that by vaccinating them, if your horse were to be in that small population of horses that did become neurologic, that it would help to keep the neurological signs under better control. And the horses that are not vaccinated, that become very neurologic, often can end up not making it, unfortunately.
And for horses that don't have the neurologic symptoms,
Mhm.
is it something they can recover fully from?
Sure, sure. So, and not every neurological horse can't recover. It just, the ones that are unvaccinated or have really bad neurological symptoms are the ones that tend to not make it. But the ones that do not have a neurological form typically are febrile with respiratory disease, meaning cough, sneeze, typical respiratory symptoms, just like you and I having the flu.
Mhm.
And it's important that they get good suppurative care, right? Because we don't want that to turn into a secondary pneumonia, which can also be deadly in some horses. But yes, they can recover. And I do believe that if they're vaccinated, that they're have a much higher level of protection. And if they get that neurological form, that the signs are a lot less, leading to a higher rate of survival.
Okay, great. And then for not great. Not
Not great.
great. None of this is great,
Yes.
but,
No.
understood. And for influenza, you mentioned that the signs are very similar to EHV. How does it start to differ in terms of how like, what influenza looks like and if and how it's treated?
Yeah. So influenza has a lower mortality. Um, they typically also have the same type of respiratory signs: cough, nasal discharge, will become febrile. When they become febrile, they become quite contagious. The biggest thing with equine influenza is, again, if they're not given good suppurative care, it can turn into a secondary pneumonia. Influenza is interesting. It attacks the trachea and the lung. You have all these little cilia that are there that are trying to clean everything out all the time, to keep your lungs clean. And what it does, the virus attacks those little cilia that are trying to clean everything out, um, leading to a higher exposure to viruses, bacteria, therefore potentially causing secondary pneumonia. Um, I always tell horse owners, for every day that that horse has a fever, that they should be out of work. Those horses that develop or have influenza often have long-term um, damage to their trachea. It's a very thin, friable tissue, and they can often have exercise-induced coughing that can go on for life. So I try to tell people it's really important to rest them. Even though influenza is not a high mortality, horses don't typically die from influenza, especially if they're vaccinated, but it can put them out of work for weeks and weeks. So
So you're saying if a horse has a fever for, let's say, 3 days, they get 3 days no work.
they get 3 weeks no work.
Weeks. I was
Yep.
gonna say that seems
Yeah. So for every day they have
low.
a fever, they should take a week
That's the
off
number of weeks.
of exercise and work. I mean, they can be turned out and stuff, but we
Yeah,
recommend not riding them or working them.
okay.
Yep.
That's really helpful to know. Um, Last one that I would love to touch on is strangles. Tell us what that looks like and and what the risks are?
Yeah, so strangles comes from essentially the horses in their guttural pouch get a horrible bacterial infection, literally to the point that it strangulates them, which is where the word strangles comes from. These guys usually present a little bit differently. They do become quite febrile. They can have nasal discharge, but they tend to get a large lump, like up underneath their jaw, which is in the guttural pouch. And this is highly, highly contagious. I spend a lot of time consulting farms on how to quarantine, separate horses. It is spread everywhere through water buckets, through any type of fomite, um, pitchforks, ourselves. I mean, it is, you track it on your shoes. It is very, very hard to get rid of. There also can be latent carriers. So there can be horses that are spreading strangles, but not symptomatic. And it can be very difficult to diagnose them and find them and treat them so they're not carrying it anymore. This is a disease state I try to stay far, far away from. It is economically damaging. It is it's a horrible disease state to watch horses have to go through. Um, it is not a fun one. Of all of them, that one, that one and herpes really kind of scare me the most. So
Yeah, that sounds horrible. Is there a vaccine for it? And once a horse has it, how is it treated? And is that treatment highly effective?
yeah, so there are two vaccines out there. There's one that is given intranasal, which has a little bit of a higher efficacy than the one that is given IM. Um, the one that's used IM is often used in brood mares, so it can pass on maternal antibodies to the foal because giving intranasal is going to be very specific. It's a modified live vaccine. It's not going to go systemic, right? It's just going to go in the nasal passage. So those are two vaccines. They're not as efficacious as something like equine influenza or equine herpes, and some veterinarians choose not to give them just because they can sometimes have side effects that are undesirable. The good news is that a horse that does have strangles, they typically, once they recover, they're often treated with suppurative care, sometimes with antibiotics. And once they do recover, they typically have pretty high titers for quite some time and are protected that way. We usually, if they've had strangles in the past, it's advised to test their titer level because we don't want to vaccinate them if their titers are too high. It can cause some serious side effects.
Okay. And for the EHV and equine influenza, you were vaccinating most horses every 6 months. What's the cadence for the strangles vaccine if a horse is getting it, or the intranasal vaccine?
Yeah, so it's labeled for once a year. Horses that are at very high risk sometimes will get it twice a year, but it is labeled for once a year.
Okay, great. And now tell us how, as horse owners, especially horse owners who are going to shows or, aren't totally isolated from being around other horses, what are the things that we can do preventatively to do our part and avoid a spread or help our horse not get sick?
Yeah, I could go on for hours about this. So get ready.
I'm ready.
One of okay. One of the best things you can do is just take your horse's temperature, understand what the baseline is before you put that horse on the trailer. And if it's elevated, please do not put that horse on the trailer. So again, anything above 101.5 would be considered febrile in a horse. At horse show competitions or when you're on the road, it's recommended to take a temperature twice a day. I know that seems like a lot. Even if you can take it once a day, I would be absolutely thrilled. But knowing what the baseline is before you leave would absolutely help. And just a friendly reminder to not take it right after you ride because it would be elevated. Other things that we can do, uh, I mean, the list goes on and on, right? I I always see people at the horse shows using a water hose and dunking the end of the hose into the bucket and filling up the bucket and then going to the next one and dunking it down into the bucket. Water actually can hold a lot of these viruses and diseases. So something as simple as not dunking the end of the water hose into the bucket when you go to fill them up is a big preventative care. My other pet peeve is at the horse show when everyone's got their rags and they're wiping their faces before they go into the ring. And you're up there and you're like, oh my gosh, I forgot my rag, and you grab someone else's. Well, you just wipe that entire horse's nasal area and any type of output that might be coming out. Um, Please try to carry your own rags for the horses. Things as simple as not sharing equipment. A lot of these things can live on fomites. Fomite is an inanimate object like a pitchfork or you and me. Um, these viruses can live on these objects for a long period of time. So when you come to that competition or you're off grounds trying to take your own equipment, your own tack, um, anything that belongs to your horse should stay with your horse and not be borrowed or used by other people. Um, Even something as simple as not touching every horse at the horse show, which is really hard for people to do. They want to go up and feed treats or give them a pat on the neck or, say hello to your friend's horse. But if you can help yourself from not doing that quite as much, or at least washing your hands in between handling the horses is helpful. Not letting the horses become nose to nose is another obvious one. It seems very simple. It's very cute to let them meet each other and maybe nicker at each other, but that's a big one. Again, prior to going to horse shows, vaccinating. We do recommend vaccinating at least 2 weeks before traveling so that those antibodies can be built up within the horse's system. When you do transport, it can lower their immune system. So it wouldn't be advised to vaccinate and then put the horse on the trailer the next day. Um, I'm trying to think of other preventative care things, such as, just making sure you have a negative Coggins when you leave the property. That is required to cross any state lines, but also highly recommended if you are leaving your own property at any time. Um, I mean, I just feel like this list could go on and on and on, right? But
Totally.
it's a lot of COVID common sense things, right? Trying to not touch everything, trying to disinfect your hands, wash your hands. Um, Being aware if your horse is febrile to please let somebody know. I think that is a hot topic. People are scared to share that their horse might have a fever. They're either embarrassed or they're not sure, or they're worried they're going to get kicked out of a competition. But you have to realize it's just a horse show, right? Like, let's put everyone else's horses' lives as a priority, and let's inform the horse show vet or the show manager or your trainer, whoever is there, so that the right measures can be taken. It's nothing to be embarrassed about. It's nothing you've done wrong. It just like when you send your kids to school, sometimes they get
Mhm.
the flu, and it happens, and there's no one to blame. But if you don't do something about it, then you are to blame. So
When you mentioned pitchforks, it made me think of the stabling that horses just kind of, there's this revolving door of horses that goes into a stall on a horse show grounds if they're hosting a lot of different events. Um, so when you arrive at a show and you get to your stall, is there anything? I mean, I always just, put down some shavings and hung up
yep.
the buckets. Is there anything you should be looking for or doing kind of more proactively than that?
Yeah, I think a lot of the horse shows have gotten better about disinfecting the stalls in between. But if that is not something that's happening, or if you're unsure, it never hurts to go in that stall. I always go in and check for nails as well, because people hang things up in stalls and it makes me nervous. But I always do a go over with stalls, and I have a spray bottle of some diluted bleach or any type of not any type of disinfectant. There's definitely animal safe type disinfectants that can be used. Um, but it never hurts to spray it down. The other thing is just giving it a little bit of time. So if that horse comes straight out and then you put the next horse straight in, it's amazing how much UV light and air can actually help kill viruses, right? So even just giving it a little break and a little bit of time can be somewhat helpful. But yes, we do recommend disinfecting the stall prior to going into it if the horse show's not doing it already.
Okay. And you have been to so many horse shows as the horse show vet and as a competitor. Tell us what it looks like when symptoms show up in a horse and you hear about probably a horse with a fever. What starts going on behind the scenes? And you said
Yeah,
actually you dealt with an outbreak, right? Tell us about that.
yeah. So I actually dealt with an influenza outbreak. Kind of crazy story. All the horses were properly vaccinated. Again, no one did anything wrong. But just like the flu in humans, it can change a little bit, right? And the horses somehow, developed influenza. So what goes on behind the scenes is, as a horse show vet, I get called that there's a horse with a fever and my stomach drops because praying that it's not, herpes or strangles. And, at that point, there's no test to know exactly what's going on, right? So, what happens is immediately that horse gets quarantined into at all the horse shows. There's always a quarantine location that has to be determined prior to the horse show starting. So you might not realize it, but behind the scenes, there's already a protocol in place for where that horse would go or what this would look like. So a horse goes into quarantine. It's usually a barn that's not connected to the other barns. And, basic workup is performed, heart rate, temperature, what we consider a TPR. And then if we suspect something respiratory or infectious, we would start doing more diagnostic testing, which typically looks like a nasal PCR, which is a swab, in which we would send it to a lab for them to run a PCR on it. If it's something gastrointestinal, like salmonella, we would take a feces sample and also send that to a lab. And then, unfortunately, it can take 24 to 48 hours, right? We have to overnight these to labs. When I worked in Ohio, we actually had someone drive samples down to Lexington so that it could get same day results.
Wow.
Literally, a staff from the horse show, yeah, they run an amazing horse show there. They would literally jump in a car and drive 2 hours to take it down to Lexington so we could have same day results. If you could get it there by 11 o'clock, we could have results by about 7 that night. Um, and the biggest thing as a veterinarian is you don't realize how much people are going to start talking and speculating. And it's the same panic that went on during COVID, right? Just horse show style. Um, People start talking. Why is there a horse in quarantine? Or we heard a horse had a fever, and then it just spreads like wildfire. And unfortunately, you don't have anything to tell them until the results come back. When they come back, there is some patient confidentiality, right? And so at that point, it's about notifying the horse show, it's about talking to the horse owner. Um, I know at USEF sanctioned horse shows that veterinarians have the right to inform the horse show as well as notify USEF of a horse that has any type of infectious disease. It's something that people sign off on, believe it or not, at the horse shows that we can notify them. So that goes into place. And then at that point, once an infectious disease is identified, so we identified influenza, um, and everyone goes into a panic. At that point, we started really making sure people were taking temperatures twice a day, isolating any horses that seemed a little bit off. Um, there's this really handy stall side diagnostic tool called SAA. It's serum amyloid A. It's an acute phase protein that's released from the liver that will elevate in times of infection. And so I was running those. They only take 10 minutes stall side. Um, Again, it doesn't tell you, oh, this horse has a virus or it's bacterial, but it will give you a good heads up. Like if that value was above 50, we were putting those horses in a not clinical, but highly monitored type situation. That's how I managed most of it. For people that that were curious about the state of their horse, we would run these SAAs and try to make decisions based on that. A lot of people packed up and went home, right?
Mhm.
And a lot of those horses, we ran SAAs to make sure we didn't want them traveling if it was elevated and they were at a higher risk of having an infection. Um, so that's how I managed it essentially because the PCRs took so long. Anyone that was above 50 or clinical would then get a PCR, and those horses were in quarantine for quite some time. Um, and that's a whole nother topic if you want to get into what quarantine looks like. But that's essentially what happens when there's an outbreak. And I thought the horse show did a great job managing it. I had veterinarians and horse show managers calling me from all over the country because they're worried about exhibitors leaving this horse show and going to the next horse show and taking it with them. Um, so I will say I spent probably half the time on the telephone talking to people, trying to keep everybody calm. The horses that are in quarantine, talking to the horse owners because they weren't really in the barn with their horses, right? They were quarantined. They would come in at the end of the day sometime, right before they'd go home and shower, but they didn't get to see their horses like they did all day long. Um, and so it was a lot of communication that I think is underestimated.
Tell us more about what I do wanna know what quarantine is like, and in that case, how long it lasts and how these horses get cared for and protected.
Yeah. So, you know, what we did at this particular horse show, I don't think they'll ever do again because the quarantine went on for about 3 or 4 weeks. And the horse show was generous enough to provide care and shavings and a lot of resources to the horse owners. And the policy since then is pretty much if the horse is febrile or we suspect any type of infectious disease, that they're to leave the property and either go back to their home farm or go to a hospital. Um, but at that point, it starts off by one or two, and you put them in a quarantine, and then next thing you know, the next day there's four more with a fever, and they end up in quarantine, and no one wants to take their horse home. And the horse show was so exceptionally nice that they kept them there, and we had a whole staff of people. They were in a completely different barn, over 100 yards away from the horse
Yeah.
show. And, we had a group of people that were working just with the sick horses and cleaning stalls, feeding. The horses got hand walk 3 times a day within quarantine. Movement's really important so they don't develop secondary pneumonia. Um, we had vet students from around the country volunteer to come and help. And so they would help me with running fluids, administering antibiotics. Um, there were a couple horses that did have secondary pneumonia, and they're hard to take care of. They require a lot of care. So we had almost like this little vet hospital set up within the horse show. And it did cost the horse show quite a bit of money and quite a bit of time. And they were very generous about it. But I think we all learned a lesson that the best thing is for these horses to go to a hospital where they have all the resources that they need, right? And that's in the horse's best interest.
That makes sense. And the 3 to 4 weeks duration, are you waiting for symptoms to be absent for a period of time, or is 3 or 4 weeks the amount of time that a horse with influenza gets quarantined?
Yeah, so we that was the amount of time that the quarantine went on. Some horses came in and then were out, within a week or 2 weeks.
Okay.
But then there were every day for a while. It kept like felt like horses. More and more horses were brought into quarantine that were febrile at the horse show. Um, and so that was kind of the duration of the quarantine in full. Some horses were there the entire time. Most of them were febrile and had respiratory symptoms for a couple days. It took a while. We kept doing like some PCR testing, which is pretty expensive. And it kept coming back positive. So I started actually running those SAAs. And when those would go below 50, then I would spend the money to run the PCR. That was something else I learned from the experience, because the SAA is stall side. It's way less expensive than the PCR testing, and it's quicker. So we started running those to determine when to run the PCR, and then we would release the horses once they were negative.
Got it. Wow. That sounds like quite the ordeal.
Yeah.
Um, you mentioned USEF and how USEF kind of has policies around this. Is USEF setting pretty strict protocols on what happens? Like you can just follow it by the book. So, for example, like the horse show communications to the rest of the competitors, is it very clear about when that happens and when it should not be happening? Like, do you feel like you have kind of exactly what needs to happen laid out for you by a governing body? And are there any bodies in addition to USEF, or how does that side of it work?
Yeah, so I think that USEF is a work in motion, and I think a lot of things were learned from this outbreak because I communicated with them a lot. I think one of the smartest things that they have done is they've hired someone named Dr. Katie Flynn, and all she does is biosecurity for USEF. So she is the one who is in charge of. Um, she's kind of like the state vet. She actually was the state vet in Kentucky prior to
Oh,
doing this job,
cool.
so she has a lot of experience with quarantine. So when an infectious disease is at a competition, a USEF sanctioned competition, she gets notified and she is there to assist you to help make those types of decisions. So it's not necessarily written out in black and white, like do this, do that, because
Yep.
every situation is different, right? Like there's just so many variables that I don't think anyone could potentially spell it out. But now we have this amazing resource of Dr. Flynn who will help walk us through these situations. She's so awesome to work with, and I'm really excited that they brought her on. Um,
That's really cool. Yeah, she sounds like the perfect person, and it's sounds just so helpful to have a designated guide when this happens. Um, what is typical in terms of communicating to everyone at the horse show? I know you mentioned like word can travel fast, and I'm sure that word gets kind of, isn't always 100% correct when people start talking about something like this. The reason that I ask is just as a competitor, you know, I'm curious when you should expect to hear that this is happening so that you can make the choice for yourself. Like, do I stay or do I go?
yeah, and there's a lot of different roles that are involved here. As a veterinarian, my primary role is to take care of that horse and communicate with the owner and communicate with Dr. Flynn of any type of infectious disease. From there on out, it's kind of between USEF and the horse show management to decide how they're going to release the information, if they're going to release it, what type of platform they're going to release it. I was very, very proud of this horse show. I pushed very hard for them to release this through the EDCC, even though influenza is not a reportable disease. They absolutely did not have to do this, and they probably lost a lot of money because a lot of people stayed home and didn't come
Mhm.
to the horse show for a while. But they absolutely did the right thing by informing not only the exhibitors at the horse show, but they also informed the public. Um, to make them aware. I mean, there were people that had left the week before, right? Even before we discovered the outbreak and went home and ended up that some of their horses got influenza, some of the foals on the property got influenza. So I think they did absolutely did the right thing by the equine community by doing that. I don't think that there's any black and white, like, okay, if there's an outbreak, you're going to absolutely hear 24 hours later. I think that has to be determined between the horse show management and USEF, and it relies on a lot of variables: how severe it is, how was that horse tested, are we 100% sure it's positive, was it quarantined prior to it becoming febrile, therefore before it really was contagious. There's a lot of factors in there, and so it's going to be a case by case situation. But I do know that USEF does have some newer plans in place to make sure to inform the people that need to know that are at the horse show to help protect the welfare of the horse.
And even though there are a lot of variables, like how big is are the grounds at an event and how many horses are there and how close is everyone stabled? But and so you can tell me this isn't a fair question, but
It's
with
okay.
you and your own horse or horses at a show, if you hear that there's influenza or strangles or each EHV happening on the grounds or potentially happening on the grounds, would you just get out of there?
I would run an SAA on the horse because I don't want to transport that horse if it does have influenza or equine herpes or strangles. Transporting can really put them at risk of secondary pneumonia. So I would not want to put them on the trailer. So for me, I would test all of the horses, not necessarily a PCR. And
Yep.
that's a whole nother topic, but I would run an SAA. That's what I would do, or some basic blood work. Make sure that they deem healthy for travel, and then I would take them home and quarantine them.
I love it. Um, I'm taking like furiously taking notes here. Um, okay, let's talk about quarantine in general. So, for are you a proponent of quarantining like any new horse that arrives at a barn? Are you a proponent of quarantining any horse that arrives back to a barn from a horse show? What's kind of the ideal scenario there?
Yes, and I realize this is extremely difficult in most farms. Most farms don't have a quarantine issue or a quarantine location that is truly a quarantine. It is absolutely recommended to try to quarantine these horses for 2 weeks. I own a barn. I understand how hard this is. So there's little things that I would do. At my own farm, such as trying to keep the horses that come back from a horse show in kind of a grouped area, using the same pitchfork, manure buckets for those horses, right? Trying to segregate them, not letting them be turned out with the other horses. I realize it's not 100% or foolproof, but I also know that reality and the resources that we all have to work with are sometimes limiting, and we have to do the best we can. So there are small things that you can do, like not sharing tack, not sharing equipment, trying to keep those horses at least separated or segregated in whatever fashion you can do at your farm for 2 weeks. And I do think that's extremely helpful. If you can't do that, going up and down the aisle and taking temperature twice a day, really, really important. A lot of these horses are not contagious until sometimes 12, 24 hours post the time that they start showing clinical signs, which includes a fever. So the minute that horse looks febrile, quarantine it, really get it out of there. And that's one of the best things that you can do. So at the very minimum, we should be taking temperatures of the horses twice a day when they come back for 2 weeks.
That's the first good news that I've heard is that generally they're not contagious until they have that fever. That's
Yeah,
great.
yeah. Not always,
We
but there is
yeah,
a very small window in there, and if you can
yeah.
catch it, you can sometimes really prevent, um, some outbreaks. So, yeah.
We need to get I mean, this I'm sure they're in the works and you know about what's happening, but I'm just thinking about all the wearables that humans have to have the temp, constantly being recorded and fed to us on our phone apps. That would be nice to not have to be, taking temps twice a day of multiple horses for a lot of people.
Well, it's, right now, they're working on putting it in the microchips,
Oh, how cool.
and they have them, but I think they're in the process of validating, to making sure they're accurate. It's validation studies. So
Yeah.
I would say to the public, I would expect to see that soon, sooner than later. I think that's going to be a thing. And I think they'll eventually, might be 5 years down the road, but I think horses that are not microchipped will be required to have microchips that do have a thermal reading on them, so that eventually everyone can get on board. Because, man, would that make it easier to take temperatures?
Cool. That's awesome. I feel like we just got like a secret. Um, okay, we've talked a little bit about vaccinations, and I want to make sure that I like ask the full question with you. So we talked about EHV, influenza, strangles happening once a year, and those other two happening twice a year. Are there other vaccinations that we should mention as we talk about equine biosecurity?
Yeah, and there's your vaccines are really split into two groups, right? You've got your core vaccines, and those are 5 vaccines that every horse every spring should be getting. So Eastern, Western, tetanus, West Nile, and rabies. Every single horse every year should get those every spring. And then you have your risk based, and a lot of those are based on geographical areas and exposure. So, flu and herpes are actually risk based, believe it or not, even though they should be, um, given every 6 months. And then you've got strangles, you've got Potomac horse fever, you've got botulism. Um, Trying to think what else is in that group. Lepto. There's quite a few other risk based vaccines that you should talk to your veterinarian about and what is appropriate for your horse, again based on geographical area and typically how often they're commingling or traveling with other horses. um, But really, when it comes to biosecurity, flu and herpes are really your standard. Every horse that's traveling really needs to have it every 6 months. Um, the influenza and herpes particularly, is not a very stable antigen, and it doesn't work for a very long time. So every 6 months is definitely recommended compared to annually, if they're out commingling with other horses.
And do most shows require herpes and influenza, or is that because it's risk-based, is that just by choice for most places?
So anything that is under USEF, which is most of your English bodies, dressage, eventing, saddlebreds, they all require proof of vaccine within the last 6 months of herpes. Anything FEI is even stricter. It is every 6 months, but they're really, really strict. Like an FEI approved vet has to give the vaccine and sign it in their passport, and they get their temperature checks multiple times a day. It's very strict. Some of the other governing bodies, I know, like on the racetrack, they're requiring flu rhino now, which wasn't always required in the past. Um, some of the other governing bodies, as far as Western pleasure, are also requiring it, but not every single one. So you really have to check with your organization or who you're competing with or a location that you're going to really understand what the requirements are.
Okay, good to know. And just to kind of I just looked at the clock. I can't believe we're already toward the end here. But to kind of start closing out, are there any big misconceptions that riders have about biosecurity that you could help us clear up?
I don't know about misconceptions, but I think it's something that everyone thinks is not going to happen to them, right? And it's something that I think it's a boring topic. It's not super exciting, right? It's something that kind of gets overlooked, and I do think COVID helped bring it to life and make it a little bit real for us in the equine community. But I think that's the biggest thing, is that people just maybe don't always take it seriously or take the time to really think about it and what it potentially could mean to their animal. And that's all that I ask, is that people have a little bit more awareness. When you're out there mingling with other animals, just trying to keep your horse safe, because whether you're showing or trail riding, even something like equine influenza that doesn't have a high mortality could put your horse out for weeks and weeks potentially, and have lasting effects. So these are serious diseases, and we need to do the best that we can to protect our own horses and protect everyone else's horses.
Totally. And to be honest, like I don't find this boring at all because so much of what you have taught us tonight are things that just weren't at in my mind. Like when you talk about not letting the horses go nose to nose or dunking the water hose, it's things that you walk around a horse show and you're cringing. But those of us who are doing it, we're so unaware, and it's really nice to just be a little bit better each day. And you're helping us be better by bringing these things to light and helping us be thoughtful about them. So I have to say, I don't, I don't think it's boring, and
Oh,
I'm learning a lot. So thank you for that. And you mentioned a couple of things that are kind of positive evolutions in this area. So you mentioned like COVID kind of helps people understand risks and prevention and everything that COVID has made us aware of. You mentioned these microchips that could have temperature reading, which is really cool. Is there anything else that's kind of part of a positive shift in this realm? Either technology like the microchips that are um, in the near future, or just people's shifts in attitudes and behaviors that you've seen?
yeah. And honestly, those microchips, I would love if vet records could get put in them, and vaccine records. I always imagine, like, could you
Yeah.
imagine taking your dog to the groomer and they could just scan it and see that the dog was vaccinated? And same thing with the horse. Wouldn't that be awesome?
It
I
would
know
be
they're working.
awesome for me too. They
Yes.
asked me, like, what my history is, I'm like, "I'm not sure." Yeah, I like
It
that
would
idea.
be amazing. I know people have been trying to do it and working on it, but I hope that that type of technology does continue to evolve, and that we get that in the future, because I think it's only going to better the welfare of our horses. Um, And then what else did you ask? Is there anything else that's new?
Just yeah,
Or
anything positive on the horizon, and I know that Dr. Flynn is probably a positive shift too at USEF. So it sounds like there's just good things happening, like things are moving in the right direction.
yeah, I just think there's a lot more awareness around the topic. And I think a lot of the governing bodies are taking it more seriously. They're cracking down more on actually checking vet records. I can't tell you how many horse shows I've gone to and no one's ever asked me for a proof of vaccines, right? Maybe because I'm a
Yeah,
vet, so they don't ask. But even though it's required, they don't have the manpower to necessarily ask every horse owner to provide that, and so it gets skipped over often. Um, and I know even USEF is starting to put into their system Coggins and vaccine records into like their horse showing system, which is a positive thing. Um, I think since COVID, especially, there's just a lot more awareness around biosecurity. I think people are
yeah.
taking it seriously. I think the media has created a platform where we're now more aware of these outbreaks. 20 years ago, there'd be an outbreak in Europe and no one really heard about it, right? But now with social media and people talking about it and it being reportable, I think there's just more and more awareness out there, which is great, right?
That's great,
So,
and
yeah.
everyone who's listening to this is more aware too. Um, the last thing I wanna ask you is not biosecurity specific, but I can tell that you are obviously a horse lover, but also just a learner, and Ride IQ members are that way too. I love how much they want to learn and their curiosity. And so I'm wondering, is there anything that you recommend, whether it's a book or a podcast or an article, that as a horse person, you just would like to pass on to others?
Yeah, I mean, I will say the company I work for, Zoetis, they do a ton of horse owner research or resources. So I'm not trying to sit here and promote my company. I just think it's
No, that's awesome.
amazing the amount
Yeah.
of resources that they have. So you can go on there. They have YouTube Ask the Expert series where you can listen to different veterinarians talk about different disease states as you're driving down the road. They have little surveys like, should I deworm my horse? And you answer all these questions, and then it'll help guide you in the right direction. There are so many resources. It's unbelievable. Um, I, as a veterinarian, still love the magazine, The Horse. I don't know if you read that. It's kind of more medically focused, and it's in layman's terms, which sometimes, even as a vet, I want to read about. Um, and that's one of my favorite resources. I'm trying to think. I mean, there's so much out there, even on TikTok and YouTube. There's a lot of good information out there. Just make sure to double check and see where it's all coming from.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
I love it. Well, you have been such an amazing guest. Thank you for taking the time. If people want to learn more from you or follow you, are you online? Are there places that they can follow you or contact you?
Um, I mean, they can absolutely contact me. If you just search my name on the internet, you're going to find me, whether it's through Zoetis or my own vet clinic. They absolutely can email me, ask any questions they have. I'm not a ton on social media. I have a dog named Bad Boy Brady, and he has an account, so
Oh,
you could
that's
find
so
me through
cute.
there.
Okay.
I've just have never been like a huge social media person, but I do have a Facebook, so you can look me up. Um, it's just
I,
not my like I don't have time to I literally
I
don't
was
have
gonna
time.
say, you told us at the beginning, you're running a barn, showing, running a
Yeah.
clinic. So we understand.
Yeah. But
But that's great to
absolutely,
know.
yeah, and if you wanna share my email, you're more than welcome to. It's no problem.
Okay. Wonderful. Well, this has been such a treat. Thank you so much, Dr. Helbig, for teaching us all about equine biosecurity and making us better horse people.
Oh, well, thank you so much for having me.
Have a good night, everybody.